My name is Matt Braley-Berger. I'm a domain specialist with Borland Software. The presentation is called Agile Testing, a Practical Approach. The idea is organizations, it's becoming more and more predominant that organizations want to adopt more agile practices, specifically in agile testing. The challenge, of course, is if you're an organization that's been doing traditional development for quite a while, there are certain intermediary stages where the organizations need to do certain things to take advantage of existing resources while you're going in towards the transition to more agility. And so we're looking at more of a practical approach to doing this. And so we start off with a lot of these types of discussions talking about the consequences of poor quality. So organizations, there are a lot of different challenges that we face as an industry, but there are a lot of things that have driven us towards correcting why we do software the way we do software. So people have lost jobs, companies have lost money, customers sue, stock values go down. There are a lot of challenges that have happened because of aspects of poor quality. One might argue it may be the way we develop software. So if you're doing more traditional waterfall development, it's very difficult late in the life cycle to actually address any of these challenges, these changes, without having to really incur considerable cost. Or in some cases, it's just too late to make some of the changes, and these changes just never happen. So the presentation really deals about Agile itself, what Agile means, understanding from Borland's perspective, working with our own internal customers and customers externally, how we've actually been able to make people successful, how other people we've observed being successful. Talk about Agile and testing itself, the role of the tester, how automation is a very critical piece of being Agile, and how test management is a very easy thing for organizations to begin adopting and becoming more Agile with. Talking about maybe how organizations can then move in that direction more definitely. Talking about unit testing, acceptance testing, this concept of regression testing. Some of these things don't disappear, particularly if you are a more traditional software company. I'll talk about performance testing and talking specifically more about Borland's own journey into Agile itself. So, very high level, some Agile concepts. The Agile Manifesto is a very important piece that drives behind things like extreme programming and Scrum, very popular in the marketplace. Ultimately, though, these have been around for quite a while. Even though there's a fairly recent run-up in companies trying to adopt Agile, Gartner and Forrester have only found that really only about 17% of organizations are ultimately adopting Agile methods and practices. But in either instance, these are all based along the Agile Manifesto itself. Also talks about things like pair programming, talks about things like test management being a very important piece of doing Agile and Agile testing. In fact, now that we're talking about more Agile software projects, testing is an important ingrained part of everybody's life cycle. So you may still have separate testers, and our hypothesis, and our maybe we'll say our theory here, proven quite frankly, that testers can actually be testers in the scope of an Agile project. They don't necessarily have to be developers and testers now flattened out in an organization like something like Scrum may talk about specifically. We've seen a lot of customers very, very successful being able to use QA as a separate entity, particularly if you've got very heavy business QA people, folks who understand how stock markets work, how the insurance industry works. And these are people who have a lot of value still on our project team, and the key when we talk about this in Agile is just making sure that they're a part of that core team itself, not the 2 weeks at the end of the cycle when we have to test something that we don't have enough time to actually correct. Refactoring is another important piece. Traditionally, again, some of these organizations do talk, or some of these methodologies talk about flattening out all these various barriers or these various role definitions we may have in a traditional waterfall project. So really we're saying in a lot of Agile methods, there is no analyst, there really is no architect, there really is no QA person. And again, as I was saying, we've seen through our customers and through our own implementation, testers as a separate discipline can be very successful in an Agile project and provide quite a bit of value. Another piece that's very important and we talk about quite frequently is the idea of empowerment and ownership. And so the ability for team members to actually feel that they are ultimately choosing what needs to be done, ultimately owning the results of what they're doing, and if there's any tooling required, that they've chosen and agree with why those tooling choices had to be made, quite frankly. Scrum, which is a practice that Borland adopted about 18 months ago. We've been very successful with that. We have a number of clients who've been doing it. Scrum at its highest level is really based on 3 roles, 3 ceremonies, 3 artifacts. And so it doesn't really go into too deeply around how we do testing, how we do architecture, how we do some of these various parts of what we traditionally do in waterfall. The idea is that the team becomes self-managing and empowered to make their own decisions to ultimately be successful. So at the highest level, there's a product owner, there's a Scrum master, and then there's a team member. In terms of actual ceremonies, there's a sprint planning meeting, there's a daily Scrum meeting. That's a very critical piece, particularly if we do have QA as a separate discipline, and we have the sprint review meeting itself, ways we can actually learn from what we just accomplished. We have various artifacts. We have this product backlog, the sprint backlog, the burn down chart, things that actually help us understand with the user stories how we're actually progressing over the scope of our project. And we believe actually as a separate tester, they have a lot of value in being able to look at these user stories and actually provide some feedback where traditionally a lot of product owners may not understand testing implications, particularly in performance testing. So the Manifesto for Software Development talks about individuals and interactions over process and tools. Doesn't mean no process or no tools. We talk about working software over comprehensive documentation. We talk about customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Very challenging for a lot of our customers to first adopt, because if you are used to being heavily driven by the contract, not only does your organization and your development team really reflect that structure, so that's why waterfall often comes into this. You have to make sure the requirements were properly set up before you have the team go and develop anything. We're talking about changing this quite significantly. We're talking about having to make our customers far more collaborative, maybe not having as much of a contract, focusing, of course, on actual quality software that we've created as a result and our way of actually demonstrating our adherence to these requirements themselves of the user stories. So it's, again, a very different way of looking at things. And again, because we're looking at the project quite a bit differently, we believe that QA has a very important role as a distinct function in providing really a different perspective for the project team itself. So very quickly, some myths when you look at Agile itself. The myth that there's no design. Of course there's design. Design is believed to be inherent, created by the project team. A lot of organizations that have concepts of enterprise architecture we've seen will actually have enterprise architects as a part of the project team. They provide inherent architecture and design through the development. No testing is another myth. Of course there's testing. In fact, most Agile methods preach that everybody becomes a tester to some degree. And in fact, in the best of situations, our developers, or the folks who would classify themselves as developers, should be creating their own automation to actually reflect their tests themselves. Of course, no documentation is another pure myth. Always going to be documentation. The key is that documentation itself is derived based on the functions that are being created rather than on specifically these plans that get set out originally and then ultimately changed throughout the scope of the project. Some other ones is no idea of progress, that Agile projects are inherently poor in quality. I argue they're actually higher in quality because quality is much more deeply ingrained in the process. Another one, they say that auditors simply won't allow it. Well, I actually worked with many clients who've even passed things like FDA audits or SOX audits, basically because they have some sort of a defined audit trail that happens through way of automation itself. So Agile itself does not mean you can't have or can't pass an audit. It certainly means there's other things you need to take into account as you're going through this.
You've just watched part 1 of this 5-part video program, Agile Testing, a Practical Approach, part of the Agile Educational Video Series at agilejournal.com. You can view the rest of this program or other programs in this series by visiting the Media Center at www.agilejournal.com.